It started with a developer buying up 6 square blocks of what is now the co-ops and their project, those 6 square blocks, in the middle and late 60s. And their plans were to tear it all down and to build high rises, to build 3 times what you now see, which is what you now see is an office building, what was a hotel, and 3 apartment buildings. And citizens became alarmed, started door knocking, started saying, listen, they're going to wreck our neighborhood. And then there was a lot of activity for over 10 years, actually almost 15 years. There was a lot of protest in the neighborhood. And finally, it appeared that they were not going to be able to do the whole 3 phases that they wanted to do. They did 1 phase, it ran out of money, and so the rest of the buildings just sat. And they eventually, we convinced the government of Canada to buy them and turn them into cooperatives. So that began the beginning of the Milton Park Cooperatives, which is now 22 co-ops and nonprofit housing corporations.
Now, it is one of the largest co-op communities, or
in,
if the largest
in North America. Yeah, it is. And it is heavily subsidized through Canada Mortgage and Housing. It's by the taxpayers of Canada.
Now, how did you get the idea to turn the neighborhood into a co-op community? I mean, during the process of the Concordia?
Because that was
Those were our values.
those were our values. Yeah.
Those were our
Okay.
values. We didn't want to save the neighborhood for the personal advantage of any individual or small group of individuals. So you have to bear in mind that this whole uprising took place in the 60s, the famous 60s. And in the famous 60s had very strong values of participatory democracy, of a cooperative society, and so on and so forth. And therefore, we carried those values into the struggle to save the neighborhood. And what better formula for housing than for it to be cooperative housing? Following the Rochdale principles, where in England, in a town called Rochdale, the modern cooperative movement was founded on basic principles: 1 person, 1 vote. Everybody has an equal stake in how the co-op is managed, and so on and so forth. Out of those principles, we decided to extend them to a whole larger community, and therefore formed a federation based upon of cooperatives and nonprofit housing corporations on those principles. And so that's how it held together and succeeded.
Now, had the city of Montreal or the country, across Canada, had it ever seen that kind of citizen engagement against such a large-scale development?
No, it was one of the first, and in fact the city of Montreal, which had at that time this mayor who was a megalomaniac called Jean Drapeau, he was very much opposed to this project. But we had friends within the apparatus who helped us by giving us documentary evidence as to what was being planned in destroying this neighborhood and building the so-called city of the 21st century. They would actually reveal to us what the intentions of the Drapeau regime was, which was to expand the center of the city northwards and to make it into an extension of downtown in a dramatic sense. So, but in terms of the actual political elite, the elected people, they were very much opposed to what we were doing, and so we had them as an obstacle. The provincial government was not friendly to us either, so we really had to go directly to Ottawa, and there we found some sympathetic ears, and that's how it began.
Well, it was the Trudeau years, and the Trudeau government had already passed a law saying that they would preserve the downtowns of old cities in Canada, most at that time mostly in Atlantic Canada and Montreal. So there was already that feeling from the Trudeau government to preserve downtowns.
Now, what was it about the Milton Park community that Concordia Estates really, why did they want to come here, and why did they choose that area along Park Avenue in this community?
Well, it was very close to downtown, as Dimitri said. I mean, it still is. You can still walk downtown from here, which makes it such a good neighborhood.
And from what I've read, I mean, I know they got a lot of funding from the Ford Foundation, in
Yes.
that they said it was slum clearance. Like, how did they ever...
Urban renewal, it was called at the time.
It was called urban renewal.
Those were the buzzwords of the 60s.
The housing had not been well cared for since after the war, after the Second World War, when the bourgeois families and owners were starting to move out. And the area was turned into rooming houses and small apartments. The buildings, the houses were subdivided. So some of them were still cared for, but many of them were not. So it was considered slum housing. In fact, it was far from slum housing. Even in the condition that it was before they were renovated, they were not slum houses. They had old electricity. And in some cases old plumbing, but they were far from being slums.
Lucia said that we were close to downtown, and therefore it was a very desirable urban space. But you know, market capitalism has the genius of selling you something that you already own. So they wanted to build here because it was close to downtown, but it also was close to the mountain. So they wanted to sell you a view of the mountain. And I remember the first advertisings that were placed in the newspapers to rent the apartments of La Cité. The irony is that they would put their apartment tower, and then they would surround it with all the Victorian houses that we saved.
But we had saved.
So how do you like that?
That's very interesting.
They're very demonically clever, yes.
Yeah.
But we could see through that, of course.
Now, when did the two of you move to the community? I mean, what were your stories, and how did you end up here in Milton Park?
We moved we moved here in 1971, which was right at the height of the first phase of the struggle to save the neighborhood.
And how long did this process take?
And that process, as I said a bit ago, it took about 10 years.
10 years.
Yes. So that was right at the beginning of it.
And in those 10 years, I mean, how did the city change toward the development, and how did the attitude in the community change?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because when we first started the Milton Park Citizens Committee, which pioneered especially the first phase of the struggle, I remember quite clearly we wrote a appeal and a fundraising appeal to all the architects of Montreal to help us fight the good fight. And absolutely no one replied to us except one architect who was a very famous urban reformer, an incredible person by the name of Michael Fish. And he also became a pioneer with Lucia in the founding of Save Montreal and Heritage Montreal later, and so on and so forth. And what he explained to us in his letter, and it was a revelation to us, in his letter and when we met him, was that it is cheaper, and he worked it out in terms of dollars and cents, it is cheaper to renovate these houses than to demolish them and build something new. So we had a powerful argument. Even for those who control the money, the purses at the federal level or the provincial level or the municipal level, it was cheaper to renovate these old Victorian 19th century, early 20th century housing and bring them up to the level of the National Housing Code, which means, you know, proper plumbing, electricity, and all the rest of that, than to demolish them and build something new. So.
Well, to build something of the same dimensions. I mean, if you build a high rise, then that's not the case, of course. But yeah, that's what Michael said, and
Now, what kind of actions were taken by the Milton Park Citizens Committee to raise awareness in the media or to let other Montrealers know about what was happening here?
We did everything that we learned in the 60s. We went door to door, talking to people. We signed petitions. We had demonstrations. We had public information meetings.
We presented alternatives.
We presented
Which-
alternatives.
which
that,
was,
that was very interesting
which was
too.
the
Another
co-ops,
great
yes.
architect here who still lives in this area called Joe Baker, who's teaching at McGill. He created a whole maquette with his students of what a cooperative, a renovated cooperative housing project like Milton Park would actually look like.
Using the old buildings.
Yeah.
And expanding them and using, for example, building a little more in backyards and well, whatever. But increasing the density, but using the old buildings.
So hundreds of people will go and see this exhibit and is it, gee, that's where I live. Is that the way it's going to look? So you see, it was a very clear, documented way in which something different and better could actually look like. So we did that. We had sit-ins. We had hunger strikes. Some of us were arrested and we went to jail and had a trial, found not guilty, and then another cycle of protest took place and so on and so forth. So we didn't, we had a pause, but we didn't actually give up throughout it. In the end, we won.
Now, this case specifically, because it seems like this was the very first instance, I don't know if in Canada, but I know in Montreal it's one of the first instances of citizens fighting large-scale development. How did you feel about it at the time?
Actually, Lucia could tell you that there were other cases of important urban struggles that took place in other parts of the city, which she was involved in directly and indirectly.
Yeah, actually before that, 1966, I helped people who lived on Selby Street to fight against the destruction of similar kinds of housing, greystones, in order to build the Ville Marie Expressway. It was all going on at the same time.